The ballroom was huge, like a palace made of glass and gold. It glittered. 1,000 tiny lights in the ceiling looked like stars frozen in place. Below them, people moved in a slow, beautiful dance. They held thin glasses that caught the light. Their laughter was a soft, polite sound, like the clinking of ice. Everyone looked perfect. The men in dark suits, the women in dresses that flowed like water. It was a picture of success, of money, of everything being just right. In the corner, almost hidden by a large leafy plant, was a grand piano. It was black and shiny, a beautiful object. And at that piano, her back straight, was the pianist. She was a woman who seemed to fit right into the background. Her dress was simple, dark. Her face was calm, a mask of quiet focus. She looked at her hands, not at the crowd. To the people in the room, she was just another part of the furniture. The pretty piano, the pretty player, making pretty noise. Her fingers moved across the keys without seeming to think. They played a tune that was sweet and light. It floated up into the air and mixed with the smell of perfume and fancy food. It was the kind of music you hear in an expensive elevator or a nice hotel lobby. It was meant to be smooth. It was meant to be safe. It asked for no attention. It was a gentle hum, a sonic wallpaper, just as the event planner had ordered. Classical but familiar, the planner had said that afternoon, her voice busy and sharp. Think pleasant. Think simple. You are the atmosphere. No drama, okay? We don't want anyone to actually stop talking. The pianist had just nodded. She was used to it. This was her job. She played for weddings where no one listened, for restaurants where the music was drowned out by forks on plates. She was a ghost, making sound for people who lived in a world of other, more important sounds. But inside, where no one could see, was a different story. Once, music had been a wild thing for her. As a girl, she would sit at her old scratched-up piano at home and get lost for hours. She would play until her fingers ached, trying to capture a feeling, the storm outside her window, the sadness of a lost pet, the crazy joy of a summer day. Her grandmother, who had the warmest hands, would sit beside her. She didn't teach her from books. She would play old folk songs, songs from the old country, songs full of stories. There was nothing simple about them. They were full of life and love and tears. That girl felt very far away now. As her safe, careful melody wound its way through the ballroom, she allowed herself one quick glance up. She saw the faces, the smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the man laughing a little too loudly at his boss's joke, the woman staring into her drink, looking alone in a crowd of hundreds. She saw the young staff, the servers weaving through the crowd with heavy trays. Their backs were stiff, their own smiles were painted on, a different kind of mask. One young server, maybe the same age her own daughter would be, caught her eye for a second. She looked so tired. Her feet must have been hurting in those shoes. And in that moment, the music under her fingers felt like a lie. This soft, tinkling stream of notes had nothing to do with the real, tired, hopeful, complicated people in this room. It wasn't speaking to the man worrying about his job, or the woman feeling lonely, or the young server dreaming of getting off her feet. It was just covering up the silence. It was keeping everything smooth on the surface, so no one had to look at what was underneath. A strange feeling started in her chest. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was more like a sadness, a deep disappointment. She was using this beautiful, powerful instrument, this thing that could make people feel everything, to make people feel nothing. She was turning grand stories into a single, boring sentence. Her grandmother's face popped into her mind. She would have listened to this safe music and gently shaken her head. "Where is the heart?" she would have asked. Music without heart is just noise. The pianist looked down at her hands. They were moving automatically, playing the next song on the list. They were capable hands, strong. They could do so much more. They could play a storm. They could play a lullaby. They could tell a story without words. And right then, in that room of polished perfection, she felt a desperate need for a real story. The air felt too thin, too clean. It needed some weather. It needed some truth. She finished the song she was on. The last note faded into the buzz of conversation. There was a small pause, the natural gap before she started the next piece on her list. In that silence, she took a deep, quiet breath. She looked at the sea of people, not as a crowd, but as a collection of hearts beating under all that silk can suit fabric. Her fingers, which usually found their place by habit, hovered over the keys. They were shaking just a little. The event planner was probably somewhere watching. This was breaking every rule. This could be the last job she ever got from them. But the memory of that tired young server's eyes was stronger than her fear. The simple melody she was supposed to play next died before it was born. Instead, her left hand pressed down. It wasn't a light, tinkling note. It was a low, deep, resonant sound. A blue note. It was the sound of a long day ending, of a sigh that comes from your bones. It hung in the air, thick and warm, like honey. It didn't float. It settled. A few people nearby stopped their conversation. They didn't turn their heads all the way, but their ears pricked up. Something was different. The background had just shifted. The pianist closed her eyes. She forgot about the list, the planner, the job. She let her right hand find a simple, aching pattern above that deep blue note. It was no longer a melody from a book. It was a question. It was a feeling, raw and simple, finding its way out into the glittering, artificial air. That deep blue note was like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples moved out through the room, slow and invisible, but they changed everything. For a few seconds, the pianist just followed those ripples with her fingers. Her left hand kept that low, steady heartbeat. Her right hand began to trace a simple, sad, beautiful line of melody over the top of it. It wasn't a famous song. It was something older. It felt like a memory, or a story told by firelight. The change was instant, but not loud. The polite chatter near the piano didn't stop, but it dipped. It softened. A man in a gray suit, who had been talking very seriously about numbers, paused. He didn't turn around, but his eyes lost their focus on the person in front of him. He looked past them, into the middle distance. The melody had tugged at a thread in his mind, a thread connected to a long-ago summer night, driving with the windows down. He took a slow sip of his drink, suddenly quiet. Across the room, a woman standing alone near a tall flower arrangement felt her shoulders relax. She hadn't even realized how tight they were. The music before had been like the buzzing of a faint light. This new sound was different. It had weight. It had space in it. It didn't ask for her to be happy or network. It just let her be. She found herself listening, really listening, to the journey of the notes. They felt honest dot, but the pianist saw none of this. Her eyes were closed. She was somewhere else now. The shiny ballroom was fading. In her mind, she was back in a small living room with a worn-out rug. The air smelled of cinnamon and old books. Her grandmother was there, not as an old memory, but as a feeling in her own hands. Those old folk songs weren't just tunes. They were maps of a life. They had parts that leaped for joy and parts that sank into deep sorrow, sometimes in the very same line. They didn't hide from the hard stuff. They held it, and in holding it, made it beautiful. Her safe, pre-planned music had been building a pretty wall. This music, the kind her bones remembered, was opening a door that her fingers grew bolder. The simple, sad melody began to twist and turn. It met a chord that was unexpected, a little sour, like the taste of a green apple. It made your heart squeeze for a second. Then it resolved, it found its way home, and the relief was sweet and warm. She wasn't just playing notes now. She was having a conversation. The deep bass from her left hand asked a question. The soaring right hand answered, sometimes with hope, sometimes with a sigh. Near the service entrance, the young server with the tired feet had stopped. She was holding an empty tray against her hip. Her manager hadn't seen her yet. She was staring at the pianist in the corner. Her face, which had been a mask of polite blankness all evening, was alive. Her eyes were wide. She knew this music. Not this exact song, but this feeling. It was the feeling in her mother's kitchen, late at night, the radio playing something old and crackly while her mother folded laundry. It was the sound of real life, not this pretend sparkling world she was serving. A small, real smile touched her lips. For a minute, she forgot about her aching feet. The pianist wove in a little piece of the original, simple tune she was supposed to be playing. But now, it was transformed. She played it slower, with more space around each note, and then she let it fall into a minor key. What was once cheerful became thoughtful, even a little mysterious. It was like showing the shadow side of a sunny day. A few more people turned their heads. Their conversations became whispers, then faded away. They were being pulled, gently, into a current they hadn't planned on swimming in. And then she took a risk. The music had been building, getting fuller, like a wave gathering itself. She could feel the energy in the room leaning in. It was time. Her hands flew apart for a brief, silent moment, hovering above the keys. Then she brought them down, not with a crash, but with a powerful rolling cascade of sound. It wasn't chaos. It was a controlled storm. It was all the feelings she'd seen in the room, the stress, the hidden hopes, the quiet loneliness, given a voice. It was thunder in the bass and lightning in the high notes. It was magnificent Dot at a table near the front, the keynote speaker for the evening. A man known for his sharp, logical speeches, felt his breath catch. His hand, which had been drumming on the table, stilled. He watched the woman at the piano. She was no longer a background player. She was a vessel for something bigger. She was saying with music what he had been trying to say with data all his career, that beneath the surface there is raw, powerful, human emotion that drives everything. He felt a lump form in his throat. The storm in the music passed. It didn't end. It broke apart into 1,000 glittering drops of sound, a gentle rain of high, clear notes. Then her hands settled back into that deep, steady heartbeat from the beginning. But it was different now. It was wiser. It had been through something. The melody that returned was the same folk-like tune, but it was richer, more complete. It held the memory of the storm within it. The room was utterly still. No one clinked a glass. No one coughed. 200 people were holding their breath together. They were connected, not by a business deal or a shared employer, but by a shared feeling. They had been on a journey, and they had all taken it together. The air, which had felt thin and artificial before, now felt charged and real. It was thick with shared understanding. The pianist's own heart was pounding against her ribs. Her hands were warm and alive. The fear was gone, burned away by the heat of the music. She finally opened her eyes. She saw the faces looking at her. They weren't confused or annoyed. They were open. They were grateful. In the back, near the wall, she saw the young server. The girl gave her a small, quick nod. It was a secret message between them. It said, "I heard you. I understood." She knew, in that moment, that she had broken her contract. She had shattered the simple melody rule into 1,000,000 pieces. But as she held the last resonant chord, letting it vibrate through the piano and into the quiet room, she knew something else too. For the first time in a very long time, she had told the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was what everyone had been waiting to hear. The last note did not just fade. It seemed to dissolve into the silence, becoming part of it. For a few heartbeats, there was no sound in the grand ballroom except for the distant hum of the building itself. It was a full, thick quiet, not an empty one. It was the silence of people who had been taken somewhere and were just now returning, slowly, to their bodies. The pianist kept her hands on the keys, her head bowed. The adrenaline that had carried her through the storm of her own making was now receding, and in its place, a cold trickle of reality started to seep in. Asterisk, what have I done? The thought was clear and sharp. She had been hired to be a ghost, a whisper. Instead, she had shouted a poem. She had taken over the entire room. Her eyes scanned the edge of the crowd, looking for the event planner, bracing for the angry face, the sharp gesture telling her to leave. But the first thing she saw was not anger. A few rows back, a woman was dabbing carefully at the corners of her eyes with a napkin, a quiet, embarrassed smile on her face. Next to her, a man was nodding slowly to himself, as if agreeing with a profound point no one had spoken aloud. Near the back, the young server was still standing, tray forgotten at her side, her face full of a kind of open wonder the pianist hadn't seen all night. Then the sound began. It wasn't a wild, cheering applause. It started from a few places at once, a single person clapping firmly, then another, then a small group. It spread through the room like a warm wave, growing fuller, steadier. People were turning in their chairs to face her properly. They were smiling, not the polished party smiles from before, but softer, more real ones. Some were even getting to their feet. His standing ovation was not for a show. It was for a moment they had all shared. It was a thank you. The sound of it washed over the pianist, a physical thing. Her throat felt tight. She had spent so many years being invisible that being truly seen by this many people at once was overwhelming. She didn't know what to do. So she simply took her hands from the piano, placed them in her lap, and gave a small, humble nod of her head. That's when she saw her. The event coordinator was indeed pushing her way through the crowd, her face set in a tight line. But before she could reach the piano, a tall man in a well-cut suit intercepted her. It was the keynote speaker. He put a hand on the coordinator's arm, leaning in to say something close to her ear. The coordinator's expression changed from anger to confusion, then to a stiff, professional acceptance. She glanced at the pianist, gave a curt nod, and melted back into the crowd. The keynote speaker then walked the few final steps to the piano. He was an important man, she could tell. People watched him move. He stopped beside the grand piano and extended his hand. She stood up, her legs feeling a little unsteady, and took it. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, but carrying in the now subdued room. "What is your name?" She told him, her own voice just a whisper. He held her hand for a moment longer. "I have given speeches on stages all over the world," he said, so only she could hear. "I talk about innovation, about human connection. For 20 minutes tonight, I tried to put it into words. You just put it into the air. You gave us the speech I couldn't write." He gave her hand a final shake, his eyes serious and kind. "Don't ever apologize for that." He turned and walked away, and the spell was broken. The room's noise level began to climb again, but it was different now. The chatter was more animated. People were talking to each other with more energy, gesturing with their hands. They were connected by what they had just experienced. The ice had been truly broken, not by a joke or a drink, but by a shared feeling. The pianist sat back down, her mind reeling. The planner did not come over. The evening was moving on. Her scheduled time was nearly up. For the last 10 minutes, she played again. But she could not go back to the simple, hollow melodies. She played something quiet, something peaceful, a gentle, rolling piece that felt like a calm sea after a tempest. It was still her, still true, but it was a lullaby for the room, a gentle coming down. When her time was finished, she quietly closed the lid over the piano keys. The act felt final, like closing the cover of a book. She gathered her small bag of sheet music, the unused, simple songs she was supposed to play, and stood to leave. As she made her way around the edge of the ballroom, heading for the staff exit, people stopped her. Not many. Just a few. A woman reached out and touched her arm lightly. That was just stunning, she said, her eyes searching the pianist's face. You made me remember why I love music. An older gentleman simply said, Bravo, my dear, bravo. A younger couple, holding hands, smiled at her and gave her 2 thumbs up. Like kids at a concert, each one was a small, bright pinprick of light in the fog of her nervousness. She smiled back, a real, tired, grateful smile, and mumbled her thanks. The hallway backstage was a different world, harsh fluorescent lights. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the muffled thump of a delivery door. The glamour was gone. She felt the exhaustion now, deep in her bones. She leaned against the cool wall for a moment, just breathing. The door from the ballroom swung open, and the young server hurried through, her shift finally over. She saw the pianist and stopped. She didn't say anything fancy. She just looked at her, her earlier tiredness replaced with a bright, alive energy. My mom plays piano, the server said, her voice rushed. Back home. She plays old songs, like what you did in the middle part. She would have loved that. She bit her lip and added, I sent a video to her. Just a little clip. I hope that's okay. The pianist felt a new kind of warmth then, deeper than the applause. Her music had traveled in a shaky phone video across miles to reach another mother, another home. That felt more important than anything. It's okay, the pianist said. Thank you for telling me. The server gave a quick, shy nod and rushed off down the hall to the locker room. Alone again, the pianist walked out into the cool night air. The noise of the city felt loud and jarring after the world she had just been inside. She stood on the sidewalk, the bright lights of the hotel sign glowing above her. She thought about the empty, safe path she had been on, playing wallpaper music forever. That path felt closed off now. She had stepped off it the moment she played that first blue note. She didn't know what came next. Maybe the planner would blacklist her. Maybe she'd never get another fancy gig like this. A flicker of fear came back. But then she remembered the feel of the keys under her hands when the music was true. She remembered the face of the man who had stopped clapping to just stare into space, remembering. She remembered the server's message to her mother. She had not just played music tonight. She had made contact. And that feeling, the feeling of human connection, humming through the strings of the piano and into a room full of strangers, was a thing she now knew she could not live without. It was worth any risk. As she walked to the bus stop, the weight of the unused, simple sheet music in her bag felt lighter than air. The real music, she knew, was still ringing inside her, waiting for the next door to open. The week that followed was a strange, quiet limbo. The pianist went back to her normal life. She practiced in her small apartment, the sound muffled by the walls. She taught a few lessons to reluctant children. The world outside her window didn't look any different. The sun rose and set on its usual schedule. But inside her, everything felt shifted, like a piece of furniture in a familiar room had been moved just 2 inches to the left. You wouldn't notice it unless you lived there, but it changed the feel of the whole space. She kept waiting for the phone call. The angry one. The call from the event company telling her she was unprofessional, that she had ruined the atmosphere, that they would not be using her services again. She imagined the clipped, disappointed tone of the planner's voice. That call felt like a certainty, a bill that would eventually come due for the beautiful risk she had taken. But the call that came was different. It came 3 days later, in the late afternoon. The sun was making long, lazy rectangles of light on her floor. The voice on the other end was not the planner's. It was a man's voice, calm and warm. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "I got your number from the events company. I was at the gala on Saturday. I was the one who gave the boring speech before you played." She recognized the voice. It was the keynote speaker. Her heart did a little flip. She sat down on the edge of her sofa. I remember," she said. "Good," he replied. "I meant what I said to you. I've been thinking about it ever since. That wasn't just a performance. It was. It was the heart of the evening. It turned a corporate event into a human one." He paused. She could hear papers rustling on his end. "I'm on the board of a small community arts foundation," he continued. "We have a series. We bring in artists to create something unique, something that speaks to a theme. Our next theme is the stories we carry. I was on the planning call this morning, and all I could think about was what you did. You took a simple instruction and showed us the stories in the room. I'm calling to ask if you would be interested in creating a short performance for us. Not background music. A featured 15-minute piece. We would pay you, of course. Properly." She was silent for so long, he probably thought the line had gone dead. A featured piece. A theme. Not play something pleasant, but tell us a story with your music. It was everything she had secretly wanted and never allowed herself to imagine. Yes, she finally breathed out. Yes, I would be very interested. They talked for a few more minutes. He gave her the details. It was in a month's time. It would be in a small, intimate theater, not a glittering ballroom. The audience would be there to listen. Really listen. When she hung up, her hands were trembling again, but this time it was a clean, bright excitement. She walked to her piano, the old upright that stood in her living room. She ran her fingers along the wood. "We have work to do," she whispered to it. The fear, however, didn't just vanish. It sat in the corner of the room, watching her. "You got lucky," it whispered. Asterisk, that was a one-time thing. A moment of madness that happened to work out. You can't plan for that. You can't do it again on purpose. Asterisk. The blank sheet of music paper on the stand in front of her stared back, terrifying in its emptiness. Creating something from nothing, with intention, was a different beast altogether from the spontaneous eruption at the gala. She tried to start. She tried to think of the stories we carry. She came up with little melodies, clever bits of sound. But they felt forced. They felt like she was trying to copy the feeling of that night, and it came out hollow. After 2 days of this, frustration was a bitter taste in her mouth. She was trying to build a house, but was only holding a single, beautiful brick from someone else's home. It was the memory of the server that broke the spell. The young woman who had sent the video to her mother. The pianist thought about that chain of connection. Her music, in a shaky clip, traveling to another woman who played old songs in a home far away. That was a story carried. It wasn't a grand, sweeping tale. It was a small, quiet thread connecting people. She stopped trying to compose a masterpiece. Instead, she let her hands find those old folk patterns her grandmother had taught her, the ones that felt like home. She played them slowly, messily. Then she imagined that thread stretching out. She imagined it reaching the tired server and the server's mother, and then further. What did that feel like in sound? It felt like a single clear melody line, passed from one hand to the other, each time adding a slight variation, a personal touch. She began to weave. She took that simple folk melody, her story, and let it walk into a storm, like the one she'd played at the gala, but this time it was a storm of doubt, a city noise, of loneliness. The melody almost disappeared under the crashing chords, but it didn't die. It fought its way through, changed, a little rougher, but still recognizable. Then it emerged into a calmer space. It met another fragment of melody, something different but harmonizing beautifully. A conversation, a connection found. She wasn't just writing music now. She was mapping a journey. Her journey, from the safe, simple box she had lived in, through the terrifying and beautiful risk of being seen, to the new, uncertain, but hopeful path ahead. The piece wrote itself after that. It poured out of her over the next week. She would wake up in the middle of the night with a phrase in her head and stumble to the piano to play it before it faded. She didn't hear from the event planner. The imagined angry call never came. But a few days later, an email arrived from the events company. It was a generic newsletter, but at the bottom was a short list, featured performers of the month. And there, listed between a jazz quartet and a magician, was her name with a simple note, pianist, for a truly unforgettable moment at the annual gala. She stared at it. They hadn't fired her. They had, in their own cold corporate way, celebrated her. She wasn't a problem. She was a featured performer. The world, it seemed, was not as rigid as she had believed. Sometimes it made space for truth. The day before her performance for the Arts Foundation, she was a bundle of nerves again. But it was a different kind of nervousness. Before the gala, it was the fear of being invisible forever. Now, it was the fear of not living up to a moment that had already happened. She was afraid the magic wouldn't come when called. She took a long walk to clear her head. She passed a playground where children were shrieking with laughter. She passed an old man on a bench feeding pigeons. She saw stories in every face. She carried them all with her back to her apartment. She sat at the piano one last time before the performance. She didn't play her new piece. She just played a few scales, feeling the familiar give of the keys under her fingers. This was her language. This was how she spoke. She wasn't just a player of simple melodies anymore. She was a translator of silences, a finder of threads, a weaver of the quiet stories people carried inside them. She closed the lid gently. The music was ready. And so, for the first time, was she. The little theater was nothing like the grand hotel ballroom. It was a warm wooden box of a room, smelling of old books and polished floors. The chairs were not lined up in perfect rows for a crowd, but arranged in a gentle curve around the small stage, where the piano sat under a single soft spotlight. There was no champagne, no chandeliers, just the expectant, quiet hum of people who had come to listen. They had paid for tickets, not for a party. They had come for the stories. Backstage, the pianist felt the nerves fluttering in her stomach like trapped birds. But she breathed deeply, the way she had taught herself to do. This was different. The fear wasn't about breaking rules anymore. It was about being worthy of the chance. She peeked through the curtain. She saw the keynote speaker sitting in the front row, giving her a small, reassuring nod. She saw faces of all ages, some she recognized from the community, some were strangers. And then her breath caught. Near the back, still in her simple clothes, was the young server from the gala. She had come. She had brought an older woman with her, a woman with kind, tired eyes and hands that looked strong. Her mother. The host walked onto the stage and introduced her. The words were kind, talking about an unforgettable moment and the power of music to speak where words fail. Then it was her turn. She walked out into the spotlight. The applause was warm, welcoming. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and for a second, she placed her hands in her lap and just looked at the audience. She didn't see a blur of faces. She saw the man from the gala who had stared into the distance. She saw the woman who had dabbed her eyes. She saw the server and her mother, a living link to the folk songs in her heart. She saw her own grandmother smile in her mind. Then she began. She didn't jump into the storm this time. She started at the beginning. Her fingers found a simple, clean, almost childish melody. It was pretty. It was safe. It was the simple melody she had been told to play all her life. She let it loop, again and again, each repetition a little softer, a little more trapped. The sound was pleasant, but it filled the room with a feeling of gentle loneliness. This was the wallpaper. This was the before. Then she introduced a single deep, questioning note in the bass. It was the stone dropped in the pond. The safe melody hesitated, stumbled. She played the moment of decision, a series of climbing notes that sounded like a heart beating faster, like someone walking to the edge of a cliff and looking down. The room was utterly still. You could hear the soft sound of people breathing, and then she let go. She didn't just play the piece she had practiced. She relived the journey. The music burst into the raw, aching beauty of the old folk song. It was the sound of memory, of heritage, of a truth that had been waiting to be sung. She played the storm of emotion, not just the one from the gala, but every storm she had ever held inside. The chords were thunder. The high notes were lightning cracking the sky open. But through the chaos, that folk melody persisted, fighting its way through, changed but unbroken. She played the part she had written for connection. The melody, now wiser and a little scarred, reached out. It found a harmony, a second voice in the lower register. They danced together, sometimes leading, sometimes following, talking without words. It was the sound of seeing and being seen. It was the conversation between her and the server, between her past and her present. She moved into the final section. The storm was gone. The harmonies settled. The folk melody returned, but it was no longer simple. It was rich, layered with everything that had happened. It carried the memory of the storm and the joy of the dance within it. It was stronger. It was whole. She played it with a profound tenderness, each note placed with care, like sharing a precious, hard-won secret. The last notes were not loud. They were a series of quiet, resolved chords that seemed to settle into the wood of the piano and the hearts of the listeners. She lifted her hands and let the silence hold them. For a moment, there was that same full, thick quiet from the gala. Then the applause erupted. It was not polite. It was joyous and loud. People were on their feet immediately, their faces alive with feeling. They weren't just clapping for skill. They were clapping because she had taken them somewhere, and they had felt every step of the way. She stood, her legs weak with relief and happiness, and bowed. As she looked up, she saw the server in the back, clutching her mother's arm, both of them clapping with tears on their cheeks. The mother raised a hand and touched her own heart, then pointed gently to the pianist. It was a gesture that said, "You reached mine." Afterwards, people milled around in the lobby, drinking simple coffee and talking. Several came up to her. Their words were different this time. A middle-aged man said, "That opening. That was exactly how I feel at my job every day." And then the way it broke free. He shook his head, unable to finish. A young woman, maybe a student, said, "I've never heard music that felt like a story about my own life before." "Thank you." The keynote speaker shook her hand again, his eyes bright. "You planned that," he said, amazed. "You captured the lightning in a bottle." That was even more powerful. But the most important moment came later, as the crowd thinned. The server and her mother approached shyly. The mother's eyes were red-rimmed, but shining. She spoke with a soft, accented voice. "You play like my mother," she said, taking the pianist's hands in her own rough ones. "The same soul. My daughter sent me the video. When she told me you were playing here, we had to come." She squeezed her hands. "You gave me back a piece of my home tonight. You have a gift. Don't you ever put it in a small box again." The pianist could only nod, her throat too tight for words. This was it. This was the connection that mattered. It wasn't about fame or big stages. It was about a thread, thin but strong, connecting one heart to another across generations and experiences. Walking home that night, the city sounds felt different. They didn't jar her. They were just another part of the music. The weight she had carried for years, the weight of playing small and staying safe, was gone. In its place was a new understanding. Her purpose wasn't to be the background. It was to be the bridge. The calls did start to come in after that. Not a flood, but a steady trickle. A local cafe asked her to play a weekly set of music that tells a story. A documentary filmmaker wanted her to compose a simple score for a film about immigrants. A teacher at a community center asked if she would give a workshop for teenagers on how to find their own voice in music. She said yes to all of it. She still played some of the old, simple gigs sometimes, but she never played them the same way again. Even in the background, she now looked for the thread, the human story in the room, and let it color a note or shape a phrase. She had been told to play a simple melody, and she had learned that there was no such thing. Every melody, when played with truth, carries a universe inside it. Her job was no longer just to play the notes. It was to listen for the silent stories in the air, and with her hands on the keys, give them a voice.